Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
So back when we talked about old and ancient roads, one of the pieces that I read about the Ridgeway mentioned the Domesday Book as a reference for the age of the historical site there. And I thought, have we ever talked in detail about the Domesday Book on the show? Like, I knew it had come up before, but I was like, I don't know that we've ever actually discussed the whole thing and why it existed. And then I kept finding myself just looking things up about it as a curiosity. And I was like, well, that's going to have to happen. So here we are. To contextualize all of this and really explain the scope of this thing, the BBC wrote of the Domesday Book project, quote, "It was an exercise unparalleled in contemporary Europe and was not matched in its comprehensive coverage of the country until the population censuses of the 19th century. Although Domesday itself is not a full population census, and the names that appear in it are mainly only those of people who owned the land." So it's a big old project. Big old data gathering project.
Yeah, so the Domesday Book, which looks like it should be pronounced Domesday, but is not. If you're like, what's the Domesday Book? It's a survey, like a census and a property record, much less ominous than the Doomsday that its name might suggest. It wasn't called the Domesday Book by its originator. It didn't really have a name at that point. It was just called The Description of England, with some of the documents prepared as part of its assembly, each having their own names.
And the whole project was initiated by William I, also known as William the Conqueror, and even less flatteringly, William the Bastard. We're going to give you the broad strokes on his rise to power because it makes clear exactly why he wanted this survey completed. William was born in Falaise, Normandy, most likely in 1028. His father was Robert I, Duke of Normandy, and his mother was a woman named Herleva. She's sometimes noted as being called Arlette, and she was the king's concubine, thus his less than flattering nickname. William was Robert's only son, and he was just 7 when his father became ill and died while traveling home from a trip to Jerusalem. And at that point, William, who Robert had named as an heir, became William II of Normandy.
William's life after he inherited the title of Duke of Normandy was marked by constant challenges, intrigues, and loss. His own family was pretty apathetic about his situation because they were all jockeying for power, and they knew if he died or was murdered, they would stand to benefit from that. Because he was just a child, a lot of people assumed that they could really do whatever they wanted without any real repercussions from authorities, and really they weren't wrong. Without a strong leader, some people felt comfortable just laying claim to their own power. They would build new castles with which to defend their claims, and this led to a lot of violent conflict.
Yeah, theoretically, you were supposed to get permission to build a new castle. That was not happening. And then, to make matters worse, the adults who were supposed to be supporting William and were often attacked. His personal tutor was murdered, as were 3 of his guardians. And over the years, various historians have theorized that all of this instability in his early years really catalyzed William's later hardline positions regarding law and order. After being knighted at the age of 15, William went hard trying to prosecute and punish people who had overstepped and taken advantage of the chaos of his early years as Duke. And that led to more conflict. Most of the people he was trying to reclaim land from had held it for years at that point, so they felt it was very much theirs, and they had no intention of paying any back taxes levied on it. Numerous rebellions were mounted because of all of this. And while there was mixed success for William in terms of these conflicts, he did learn a lot about battle, and he developed his style as a commander, which was direct and pragmatic.
Also during this time, William got a good bit of help from King Henry I of France, who took the throne in 1031. After things settled down for William in Normandy, he supported Henry's efforts elsewhere, especially when it came to expanding France's territory in the south.
In 1053, William married Matilda of Flanders after negotiating for her hand as part of an alliance with her father, Baldwin V. This was actually a problematic marital alliance in the eyes of the church. Pope Leo IX had stated that because the two were third cousins once removed, the marriage was incestuous and should not happen. But they got married anyway, and it seems to have been a pretty good match. They had 9 children that lived to adulthood, and Matilda ruled Normandy when William was away.
Regarding their choice to ignore the Pope, that was pretty serious. It was also a little surprising because William was known to be very religious. But 6 or 7 years into the marriage, he reconciled with the church and he made amends by agreeing to build 2 monasteries at Caen, one in his name and one in Matilda's. This penance enabled the papacy to officially sanction their marriage, and that bolstered William's position.
During another period of upheaval in Normandy, William made a deal with Edward the Confessor, who was the King of England and also William's cousin. Edward had no heir, and William thought that he could be Edward's named heir. And this was likely something that was possible because he had allied with Flanders through marriage, and as this agreement seems to have happened even before the marriage took place, but after William had made his deal with Baldwin V. So he was in a good position to be like, hey, I could handle this kind of power.
That deal became important because William had fallen out of favor with King Henry. In the meantime, Henry and Geoffrey Martel, also known as Geoffrey II, Count of Anjou, had reconciled after their own falling out, and they had joined forces to launch an attack on William's Normandy, which happened as multiple rebellion efforts were all happening within Normandy. William managed to regain control of Normandy, and then regarding his conflict with the crown and the Count of Anjou, he got lucky. King Henry died on August 4th, 1060, and his 8-year-old son Philip I took the throne, with widowed Queen Anne of Kiev serving as regent. Just a few months later, on November 14th, Geoffrey Martel also died, and his title went to his nephews. So William's 2 strongest limiters to his success in expanding Norman lands were no longer on the board, and their successors were neither as strong nor as driven to stop him.
Okay, so now we have to go back to Edward the Confessor, and we are reaching a point where there are 2 different narratives of what happened next. According to the Norman version, Edward sent Harold, Earl of Wessex, from England to Normandy to confirm the agreement that Edward would name William as his heir. Harold was shipwrecked, and he was captured by one of William's vassals, Guy I of Ponthieu. William intervened to free Harold, and Harold told William that yes, Edward was ready to confirm their bequest agreement. This involved the swearing of an oath on Harold's part. Again, that's according to Norman sources. Some of those sources include the Bayeux Tapestry, which features an image of Norman swearing fealty to William.
The alternate version suggests that Harold's mission was not about confirming that agreement, because Edward named Harold as his heir while he was on his deathbed. So either he sent Harold for a different reason or he changed his mind. But when Edward died on January 5th, 1066, the throne went to Harold after the nobility confirmed him. Unsurprisingly, this was not something that delighted William.
And it also brought conflict from other places because William wasn't the only person that thought he should inherit from Edward. Before William could even get his affairs in order to bolster his standing and get ready to attack England, Harold's brother Tostig and Harold II Hardrad of Norway invaded England to wrest power from Harold. They were unsuccessful, but left Harold weakened and low on troops. William was able to take advantage of this and was, of course, victorious at the Battle of Hastings, during which King Harold was killed. There's a particularly grisly and famous account of that death where he gets shot right in the eye, which sounds awful. But William became William the First of England on December 25th, 1066.
Yeah, we have old episodes about the Battle of Hastings and about the tapestry, all hanging out there in the archive. With William finally on the throne of England, we can finally start talking about the Domesday Book, and we will get into it after we first pause for a sponsor break.
In the 20 years after William became King of England, his leadership was as tumultuous as it had been as Duke of Normandy in France. He went home to Normandy in 1067, but he had to return to England almost immediately to deal with a series of rebellions, and he became rather ruthless in putting such rebellions down over the next several years.
William is known for introducing a lot of Norman governing structures to England. Some of these were literal structures, including the Tower of London and other castles that were intended to give Norman lords central strongholds from which they could control the surrounding lands. Those Norman lords had replaced members of England's aristocracy as part of William's restructuring, and he had instituted a landholding policy that required promises of military service to the lords that oversaw them.
William traveled between Normandy and England throughout his reign, sometimes returning to his original home for years before something like a rebellion would bring him back to England to assert his authority. And as he faced challengers both within and without his kingdom, that system of landholding that he established became more and more important to him. William I wanted to make sure that he understood completely who owned what and thus who owed him military service, as well as money. And so he decided at the end of 1085 that he needed a survey assessing who was on what land and details of any estates. This survey would ultimately yield what became known as Domesday Book.
Domesday Book is sometimes described as the way William I assessed his new kingdom. But it was almost 20 years before he initiated the project, so obviously that is not accurate. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a history that was started in the late 9th century and was updated in fits and starts until 1114, that mentions the moment that William made his decision to have the survey done, describing it this way, quote, "After this had the king a large meeting and very deep consultation with his council about this land, how it was occupied, and by what sort of men. Then he sent his men all over England into each shire, commissioning them to find out how many hundreds of hides were in the shire, what land the king himself had, and what stock upon the land, or what dues he ought to have by the year from the shire. Also, he commissioned them to record in writing how much land his archbishops had, and his diocesan bishops, and his abbots, and his earls. And though I may be prolix and tedious, what or how much each man had, who was an occupier of land in England, either in land or in stock, and how much money it were worth. So very narrowly indeed did he commission them to trace it out, that there was not one single hide nor a yard of land, nay, moreover, it is shameful to tell, though he thought it no shame to do it, not even an ox, nor a cow, nor a swine was there left, that was not set down in his writ. And all the recorded particulars were afterwards brought to him." Incidentally, hides here is not referencing animal hides. It is a measurement of land.
So Domesday Book was actually 2 books, and it still exists, but not quite in that form, and we're going to talk about that later. The first volume is called Great Domesday, and the second is called Little Domesday. There are also additional supporting pieces of writing, many of which were summarized in Great Domesday. Great Domesday is written in an abbreviated form of Latin on parchment that's made of sheepskin. Most of the ink in it is black, although red ink was used for page headers, corrections, and addendums. This totals 413 pages. Great Domesday includes most of the records collected about all of the counties surveyed, with the exception of Norfolk, Essex, and Suffolk. Those are included in Little Domesday, but not as summaries. It seems like these should have been incorporated into the larger first volume at some point, but for reasons unknown, that did not happen. This whole thing also did not include the northern areas of England. London, Winchester, and Bristol are also excluded, as are Northumberland and Durham. There may have been and probably were plans to get to all of that, but those areas and some other small towns and villages that we know existed but weren't included either never got their data collected or we do not have the records.
Little Domesday is actually a more detailed work than Great Domesday. And though its cover size is smaller, it has more pages at 475. It appears that the larger book made use of records similar to those in Little Domesday and condensed and abbreviated them. The information in Great Doomsday appears to have been written by a single person. It appears that a second scribe checked the work and made some notes. In contrast, Little Doomsday appears to have had several different people recording information in it.
Those supporting documents that we mentioned earlier offer their own unique insights into this whole project. For example, the document known as Inquisition of the County of Cambridge, which has a much longer Latin name that I thought I should not attempt, includes information on process and procedure for capturing all of this data. And it's from this document that we know that the whole thing was carried out as a series of sworn inquests. So it's believed that major landowners initially sent in information, who their tenants were, what manors were part of their land, etc., and then that information was compared to existing records. Then came the part where William sent his men all over England, as described in the quote that Tracy read earlier, to hold these inquests and get confirmation and additional details about land holdings. The commissioners conducted the proceedings at assigned circuits, each of which was divided into counties and then subdivided into fiefs, hundreds, villes, manors, and submanors, with some circuits subdividing even further. There were 7 circuits in total, with 3 to 4 commissioners assigned to each. And the juries that were assembled for these inquests were made up of Norman and Anglo-Saxon members to avoid bias. And then witnesses were called to verify the information that the landowners, which were literal landlords, had provided.
The questions asked at the inquests also appeared in the supplemental documents. There are 18 of them. What the manor was called, who held it at the time of King Edward, who holds it now, how many hides there are, how many plows held by the lord, and how many belonging to the peasants, how many villains, those were wealthy, sort of in quotation marks, indentured peasants. They would not have been wealthy at all. It was relatively more prosperous. How many cotters, those are indentured peasants who owned land totaling less than 5 acres. How many slaves, how many freemen, how many sokemen, those were freemen who owed dues to their lord. How much woodland, how much meadow, how much pasture, how many mills, how many fisheries, how much had been added or taken away from the estate, what it used to be worth altogether, and what it is worth now.
These questions were posed in triplicate. One set of answers was given for the time of Edward the Confessor before 1066. One set was to capture the situation in the aftermath of William I's redistribution of property. That was right after he took the throne. And then the third set was to reflect the situation at the time the survey was performed. And the answers to all of these questions were then compiled and used to create first one set of documents and then the summaries that appear in the Great Doomsday. Landowners' names, and they were generally all Normans with a few exceptions, were recorded, and some of their Anglo-Saxon undertenants. Once all of these inquests were complete, the commissioners then assembled together so that all of their collected data could be amassed.
So, what does all that data show? More than 13,000 places are mentioned in the Domesday Book. Most of them are still around today, although in some cases the names have changed. Sprinkled throughout all those places are 30,000 recorded manors. The total value of all the properties listed in the book is estimated at £73,000, calculated by size. 35% of the land was deemed arable, 25% was pasture or meadowland, with meadow being the dominant of the two. 15% was woodland, and the remaining 25% was listed as other.
This clearly shows, too, the way that William consolidated wealth and power among his followers. Whereas 2,000 Anglo-Saxons had owned the majority of the surveyed land in the time of Edward the Confessor, by 1086, just 200 people did, all of them Normans. 17% of all of the land in England was owned by the king and his family, and then the church, bishops and abbots owned 26%, tenants in chief owned 54%, and those 2,000 Anglo-Saxons had largely become under-tenants to those 200 Norman landholders. And it showed that 90% of the population lived outside of cities, and that 3/4 of them were serfs. And it estimated that about 16,000 troops could be called up from the existing population. What you can't get from Domesday Book is a reliable population count because, as we mentioned in the intro and then again just a little while ago, it listed only the names of landholders. So they would say who was under them, but not by name, so you can't really reconcile that with accuracy.
And Doomsday is a work that's still being researched and reinterpreted. In 2021, a paper in English Historical Review shared new insights into the work. We talked about this in Unearthed that year, but we don't expect anybody to remember that. The study that resulted in the paper was a collaboration between University of Oxford and King's College London, led by Dr. Stephen Baxter, professor of medieval history at Oxford. Their work looked specifically at one of the supporting documents, the Exon Doomsday. Its Latin name is Liber Exoniensis, and Exon Doomsday is the oldest of the manuscripts associated with the project. This particular part of the work is not with the rest of the two main sections. It's at the Exeter Cathedral Library, cataloged as MS 3500.
Yeah, I should point out, too, I didn't include it in this outline, that this also was published as a book by Baxter's team. But Baxter's team carefully analyzed Exon Doomsday to determine which of the numerous scribes, 24, who worked on it wrote which sections, and then tracked what documents each of them had worked from to do so. And it showed a really impressive level of organization and efficiency.
Dr. Baxter was quoted in the press as saying of Doomsday, quote, "This research shows the compilation of Doomsday to be one of the most remarkable feats of government in the recorded history of Britain. The survey was brilliantly conceived to generate and structure information that would enable the Conqueror's regime to maximize his revenue from different income streams. The Conqueror's regime effectively compiled and manipulated a database of England's landed wealth in less than 9 months, using technologies no more complex than parchment, pen and ink, and human interaction."
Perhaps most mind-blowing is the research team's determination that the first draft of this whole project was done in the course of just 100 days, starting on Christmas Day 1085, when William first ordered the survey, and ending on Easter 1086, which was April 5th. The work notes that taxes were collected at the same time the first pass of the survey was done, and that the inquest portion, which was more of a fact check, took place in the following 50 days, being completed on May 25th. From that point to August 1st, the information was all parsed and reorganized into statistical summaries that would lead to the production of the Great Doomsday.
It's important to point out that while this effort was unprecedented in its scope, it wasn't as though William the Conqueror conjured the idea of a land survey like this out of thin air. Quite a few of the counties that were surveyed for the Norman king had been surveyed before. Some of that documentation was used to model the structure of Domesday Book. And Domesday Book didn't supplant all those other records either. Historian Sally Harvey, who studied the Domesday Book throughout her career, wrote in 1974, quote, "We may emphasize the background documentation and treasury practice that enabled the Domesday Survey to be taken so quickly. Nevertheless, the enterprise was prodigious and indicates that existing documentation was deemed inadequate."
Yeah, there are also some surveys similar to this that had already happened in other parts of Europe. So again, not a completely new concept. Coming up, we're going to talk about how all of this information was used. But first, we will hear from the sponsors that keep Stuff You Missed in History class going. So you may be wondering, what did William I do with all of this information that he had commanded to be collected? Well, he actually died before he could do a whole lot with it. It wasn't quite completed when he died in September of 1087. As we noted, some of the major cities were not entered in the book, and information in Little Doomsday and the additional documents was likely intended to be incorporated into one main volume, but that seems to have fallen to the wayside with William's death. But it was still used to make decisions about governance and to settle disputes long after William I was gone.
As evidence of how important the project was, it wasn't until almost 100 years after the record was compiled that it got its ominous-sounding name. The 1179 Dialogue of the Exchequer is where it got the name Domesday, as that writing includes the note, quote, "Just as the sentence of that strict and terrible last judgment cannot be evaded by any art or subterfuge, so when a dispute arises in this realm concerning facts which are written down, and an appeal is made to the book itself, the evidence it gives cannot be set at naught or evaded with impunity." The name stuck. Even the Public Record Office, which was tasked with caring for the book, started to call it Domesday, and it's been known that way since the 12th century. Incidentally, the Public Record Office is now the National Archives. According to John MacDonald and G.D. Snooks, writing in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society in 1985, quote, "During the first few centuries after 1086, DB was in constant use in the Exchequer, where it held pride of place amongst treasury documents and was even seriously consulted as late as 1573 by Elizabeth I."
As we look at this project and its extraordinary collection of information, it's easy to see why it has fascinated historians and researchers and has been a topic of debate for centuries. Once again, quoting Sally Harvey, quote, "Domesday Book's own monumentality is one of its greatest hazards. Though it bulks largest as a source of information for 11th century England, it is by no means the sole survivor of late Anglo-Saxon and of Anglo-Norman administration. Many of the near contemporary texts have suffered because all have been turned into Domesday satellites, even texts which are known to contain figures and arrangements which are not those of Domesday Book. On the other hand, the effort to avoid the magnetism of Domesday has caused a few historians of administration to evade its ambit altogether. The Domesday Survey had motives and objectives. Its findings were acted upon instantly, and it remained a reference work for years to come. We gain insight into the administration which produced the survey and understand how Domesday's existence affected the character of subsequent administrative policy, particularly in the following reign. Harvey notes in that writing, which was part of the published Transactions of the Royal Historical Society, that in some cases the scholarly approach to the book kind of distances researchers from its very necessity, because it's easy to lose sight of its functional need and purpose.
But some of the problem lies in the fact that different researchers have perceived the function and purpose of the work differently. While some have focused on it as a financial tool for William I, others have suggested that its primary purpose was more about the legal establishment of a new feudalism. Obviously, both of these things can be true at once, but as historians over the centuries have sought to analyze this work and its true purpose, sometimes one or the other and even other motivations have gotten lost.
We don't actually know the exact reason or reasons that William called for this extensive survey, and it seems most likely there were multiple factors. Like, for example, we don't have any document where he says, "to determine the nature of my lands." Like, we don't have anything like that. It absolutely may have been about just taxes or establishing Norman-style feudalism, but William may have also been influenced by the fact that he was facing a likely invasion by Denmark and Norway at the time, and he wanted to know everything he could about the country for potential military strategizing. In part to see how many of those people could be called up, but also just what the country had and looked like if someone invaded. And of course, additional tax revenue that could be collected would also help war efforts. There was also a growing issue that was just bickering. The various people under William who had been given land had started to argue about whether that distribution had been handled fairly. It kind of vibes like petulant kids to me, but I have the distance of history, so it's easy to say that. But with documentation of specifics about all of these lands, such arguments could easily be put to rest.
Domesday is an important document for all the reasons mentioned in the Sally Harvey quote we read earlier, but also because it serves as the beginning of written history for a lot of towns and villages. It's become a foundational reference for historians, though its interpretation has shifted and been questioned over the years.
In 1986, to mark the 900th anniversary of William I's survey, there was a project mounted by the BBC to create a new version of the Domesday Book called Domesday Reloaded. And this was intended to create a new digital snapshot of the UK for future generations. More than 1 million people participated in this project, submitting their own digital documentary accounts of ordinary life. Per the BBC website that documented the project, quote, schools and community groups surveyed over 108,000 square kilometers of the UK and submitted more than 147,819 pages of text articles and 23,225 amateur photos, cataloging what it was like to live, work, and play in their community.
The major fault in this project was the storage media used for all that information, because remember, this was the 80s. This used laser discs. They could only be read by some computers. That particular style of disk technology really got left behind as the digital age advanced. There were efforts to access and share the community disk archive, which included updates over the years. But in June of 2018, the project was finally closed for good. The website created for it is now part of the National Archives UK Government Web Archive.
Today, the physical volumes of Domesday Book are kept in the National Archives. And remember how earlier we said there were 2 volumes? Now there are technically 5 because the book was rebound in 1984. That was part of a long-term preservation plan, because people still want to look at it. They are not readily accessible to most people in their physical form. They kind of held back for very specific requests of like scholarship and legal needs. However, there is a complete digitized version online that anyone can access. It is completely free. That is thanks to the work of public interest technologist Anna Powell-Smith, who, with permission, used digitized Domesday data compiled by J.J.N. Palmer of the University of Hull and his team. They compiled that data in the 1990s, and she used it to make an interactive website called Open Domesday. It is at opendomesday.org. Again, Domesday is spelled D-O-M-E-S. And you can click around a map to see what data was collected there in William's survey. It's a pretty cool project and massive.
And according to the BBC, Domesday is still valid as evidence to title of land. It remained the most detailed account of England and its landholdings for more than 700 years until a national census was taken in 1801.
And people still love it and spend their entire careers researching it, which I kind of love. I have a very, very, I think, hilarious email. This is from our listener, Kristen, and it is about divorce ranches. And she writes, Dear Holly and Tracy, I've been meaning to write you about your episode on divorce ranches in Nevada, as my family has had a personal experience with a divorce ranch. One summer in the mid-1960s, my parents packed the 4 of us kids into the station wagon and drove from our home in Northern California just across the state line into Nevada to a dude ranch in Verdi, Nevada. That's about 10 miles west of Reno. My parents took us there based on reports that the ranch was family-friendly. There's horse riding, swimming pool, playground, games, lots of kids to play with, etc. And when we arrived, the place appeared to live up to their expectations. However, after a time, we did begin to notice a strange demographic to the ranch. My father was the only man there who wasn't part of the staff. People kept asking us, is your mom staying here? Yes. Where's your dad? Also staying here. She then has, in quotes, question marks and exclamation points. Despite that, we did have a good time there. I still remember horseback riding and meals served family style on long tables and benches. The attached picture shows me, my 3 brothers, and my mom absorbing the atmosphere at the ranch. My dad was behind the camera. For pet tax, I'm attaching a picture of our late great kitty, Harry Potter cat. We adopted Harry Potter, who was a homeless street kitten living on the island of Elba. He was named by my daughter, who at 3rd grade had just discovered the magic of the Harry Potter books. Harry was a very well-traveled cat. He lived with us in Milan, Washington, D.C., and Beijing before retiring with us to North Carolina. Harry was very loving and was always available to help me with my costuming projects, as shown here assisting with my Ursula Sea Witch Belle Epoque cosplay construction. He was a wonderful kitty, and we miss him every day. I just want to thank you for all you do to bring history to life and into my home. I have an MA in history, but still learn something new from you in nearly every podcast. My daughter, a teacher, has also become an addict after I introduced her to you. I get a real kick out of your delivery style and feel like you guys are two of my besties that I haven't yet had the opportunity to meet. Keep up the amazing work, Kristen. This is so sweet and I love it. And I'm starting following you on Instagram, Kristen. I just love the idea of somebody going to a divorce ranch for a family vacation and kind of befuddling everyone. Like, where's your dad? Right there. I do love it, but also I love that you had a great time. That picture is gold. I hope you keep it forever and ever and ever. It's so wonderful. And Harry sounds like a wonderful cat. Thank you for giving him a home and giving him a life that many people would envy, it sounds like. If you would like to write to us, you can do so at historypodcast@iheartradio.com. If you'd like to subscribe to the show and you haven't done that yet, you can do that on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.